So welcome. Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Hobbs. I'm the co-chair of the Open Table Network, and you are more than welcome to join us at this webinar. The Open Table is a growing partnership of Christian worship communities, welcoming people who are LGBTQIA plus, so are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer or questioning, intersex, and asexual, plus all our families, friends, and allies, and anyone else who considers himself to be somewhere in and underneath that bracket. We have created the network for people in a place where sometimes church doesn't always feel the safest, and it is a really good opportunity for people to come along and just be who they are, to be with us, and to be in a safe, affirming, and kind community who is going to support them. A few years ago, we undertook a series of webinars with our patrons and with our co-chairs and various other people. And Alex and I recorded a webinar together at that point, and also some podcasts together. So for those of you who have not encountered Alex Clare-Young, Alex Clare-Young was one of our co-chairs, stood down last year, I think. And so I've done a year without Alex as my co-chair. But at the time when Alex stepped down, we really wanted to keep them on board with us, and to continue the work that we were doing together. And so we are kind of so really this is an opportunity to reconnect into Alex, and as Alex has become one of our patrons, to hear about their story kind of since that time, and to let ourselves back into their world. Alex, thank you. So lovely to see you, and so lovely to be with you again this evening. I'm guessing that most of the people who are here tonight do already know you or know of you and know stuff about you. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of your biography tonight. Also, I would encourage anyone who really doesn't know you and really wants to kind of know more. You wrote a book, so let's plug your book instead. And they can get all that information from your book that is called Transgender Human Christian. I'd really encourage people to read it. It's a fantastic read. I really enjoyed it and felt like I really got to know you when we first started to connect together. But what I will ask you to do, if it's okay, is just to give us a kind of a minute or two that covers your journey up to starting your PhD, that just gives us kind of a sense of who you are, where you've come from, and a little bit of your background.
Absolutely. So I can see from the list that I know lots of you. So I'm going to try not to be too boring and too much about myself. But I think I often, when I'm telling my story, reflect on feeling a bit like an alien when I was a child. I just felt so very different than other people. And as I have grown up, I've continued, like many people, I guess, to learn more and more about myself. That included coming out as trans when I was 18. And later coming to identify as non-binary, by which I mean that although I present and live mainly as male, I have issues with the conceptions of binary gender. I'd like to think about gender and live gender in different ways. A few years after that, I was diagnosed as autistic, which was another thing that really helped me to understand myself, and also have been grappling with physical disability for my whole life. So I used to talk about this journey from feeling like an alien to not feeling like an alien anymore, but I've realized that that's far too simplistic. That actually, when I talk about feeling like an alien when I was a child, I'm talking about feeling really alienated, feeling really alone, and that's really difficult to handle. But I think in some ways I still feel like an alien, but I feel subaltern, which is a word that marginalized peoples and communities often use to describe this sense of community on the edge of identifying with being other, or perhaps with being alien. And that's something that I hold really dear, actually, that I now see otherness as a gift and a positive thing rather than a negative thing. And in my journey towards understanding that, I became called to ministry. and I'm a minister in the United Reformed Church at the moment. But I also do all sorts of other things, including writing and speaking, and I really love speaking about justice.
And actually, all of that has outworked, I guess, in your current role, which I know you're in Cambridge right now, and you are a pioneer minister for Downing Place Church in Cambridge. Just a fantastic role, and you've done so many interesting things there while you've been undertaking that role. Do you want to just give us again another minute or two on what you're doing currently?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my role was set up because a church in Cambridge city centre realised that it didn't really know much about the communities around itself. A lot of those who attended that church and do attend that church travel in to go there. And around the church were bars and pubs and clubs and a very different world, really. So when I was called to that post, I was invited to spend lots of time in those bars and pubs and clubs, which was quite good. I had a drinks allowance. Um, and doing so to get to know people and to really find out what was on people's hearts and minds and how we could connect with people. And I discovered that people that I met out and about really, really cared about spirituality and really cared about social and eco justice. And that was really good news to me because in church, I was consistently hearing the message that, people outside of church don't care about church anymore. We're not relevant anymore. So to then go out and speak with lots of people who weren't in church and for them to actually say, well, these are the things we really care about. And for me to think, well, those are the things that churches are supposed to care about. How can we make some connections? And through doing that work, both through making connections out and about and through the networking work that the church was already doing, I met some wonderful people and we started an initiative called Solidarity Hub. And Solidarity Hub mainly meets on Sunday nights. And we basically talk about social justice and Christianity and effectively deconstruct together in a way where we have become really a little church of our own, but perhaps we wouldn't call ourselves church because we're trying to break down some of those barriers and structures that become implicit as soon as something becomes institutionalized.
Absolutely. And I mean, I've spent time with your group in Cambridge. They are an absolutely fantastic bunch. They really kind of yeah, they really enrich, I think, the people around them. So if all of that wasn't enough, on top of that, you've also managed to find the time over the last couple of years to write a PhD, which is a really impressive feat, something like akin to a marathon rather than a sprint, and a test of endurance, I think, sometimes to people I know who have completed those. And also, as a result of that, I've also had your second book published, which is fantastic news, and it's a really good book. I would really encourage if people haven't read it already, to take the time to get hold of it and read a copy. Um, Obviously, kind of, it'd be really helpful to understand a little bit about that. But I know actually for me, the thing that really kind of interests me when you talk about this subject is actually how few trans theologians there are, and that actually one of your kind of your secret missions is to try and encourage more trans people to think about, what's their role in terms of the study of theology. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that and kind of why you think that's so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So the bit of my PhD that sadly didn't get into the book and hasn't been published anywhere is the literature review. And I guess the reason that's not been published is they're kind of boring to read in a way, but actually in some ways it was the most important bit for me. So it's about looking through all of the stuff that's been written about trans people and recognizing how little of it has been written by trans people. And then when I got beyond that, what I realized was that a lot of trans people, people doing wonderful writing, were getting caught up in defending their identities. So really, they were answering the questions that people who aren't trans were asking of us,
Yeah,
kind of answering the accusation that it's not okay to be trans by writing something that explained why it was okay to be trans. And my first book kind of comes into that category. I'm telling my own story, but I'm also kind of defending myself for saying, well, this is
yeah,
why I believe theologically it's okay to be trans. And eventually, as a student, I find that really frustrating because, I could read mainly what cis men thought about, for example, the doctrine of the Trinity. I
Yeah.
might be able to read a few feminist takes on the doctrine of the Trinity. I could not read what a trans person thought about the doctrine of the Trinity because it wasn't written down anywhere. So I wanted to hear trans voices really moving beyond apologetics to what I guess I would call theology,
Yeah.
more broadly. So to talking about God and talking about what it meant to be human. And more than anything else, what I've discovered through doing the research is how important it was for me to talk with other trans people about that. And that not having those voices had really shaped my theology to that date. And my theology was really, I guess, surfacey until I did that work. But actually
Yeah.
talking to other trans people, other people who are both similar and dissimilar to me, and coming up with theology together allowed me to really expand my mind. And I also think that sometimes trans people can put some of the challenges to people who are not trans, that other people who are not trans can't. So my example for that would be to look at the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. Now I know eunuchs aren't exactly the same as trans people, but we'll park
Yeah.
that academic bit to aside for a moment. But
Yeah.
that story of the Ethiopian eunuch, at the end of the story, they say to Philip, "Look, here is water. What's to stop me being baptized?" And Philip should have noticed that by that point, right? Like, he's supposed to be the evangelist. Why has he not noticed that there's water? And why has he not done something about kind of moving this person's journey of faith on? Actually, it took someone who was a gender and sexual minority to be able to state the obvious. And so I think sometimes actually just having that power to really um, untangle some of the knots that institutions get stuck in theologically is a really exciting thing that trans people can do.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with you. And I guess it's for me, it kind of throws up the question. Obviously you've mentioned a kind of a feminist theology. We have talked in the past about queer theology. There are all sorts of different kind of theologies that come from different perspectives. Where do you think the trans theology sits alongside that? I mean, is that kind of an area of theology in its own right? Is it kind of a reinterpretation of all theology? Where does that sit for you?
So it is an area of theology in its own right, and I think one of the things for me is that because trans voices in theology are bizarrely really really new, that they need to be heard in their own right before immediately getting kind of subsumed into other stuff. So, for example, when I talked about the importance of trans voices, one of the questions that I got asked is, well, what about cis people? Can't cis people say things about this? And my response is yes, of course, and they should, and you should, but we haven't had enough places for trans people to talk about this. So
Yeah,
we need to kind of carve out our own space. But then I'd come back to that word that I used earlier, subaltern. So communities on the edge, people on the edge. And I've always found that other communities of marginalized people are where I've found most support. So going, for example, to conferences with the Council for World Mission, sitting in a room to give a conference paper, and the other people in my stream being women from Latin America and Africa who theologically think in different ways from me, perhaps, but socially want to support me.
yeah,
In the URC, my biggest source of support has been people working on Black theology
yeah,
and countering racism in the church. I've increasingly found links and overlaps and intersections between disability theologies and theologians and queer theologies and theologians. So I think those of us who are on the margins more naturally don't really form these kind of silos or binary debates against each other. We actually
yeah,
come into solidarity with each other really naturally, and that's been so wonderful for me to be able to support each other and challenge each other and learn new things.
yeah,
That I would like to see that continue and grow because we're more powerful together. We're all
yeah,
minorities, so uh,
yeah,
let's work together to kind of, I guess, topple power hierarchies.
yeah. And I guess I guess what also comes out of that for me, for thinking about some of the people who are maybe listening to this webinar, we perhaps don't all consider ourselves to be uber theologians, with lots of kind of theological knowledge, but we want to engage with the issues that affect us biblically, and kind of, and not just, as you said before, thinking about how do we defend ourselves, but actually how do we move that into a space of euphoria. So I was wondering if you had any kind of thoughts about how we could actually, people who don't necessarily have a PhD in theology, how do they engage with trans theology, trans thinking, either as a trans person or as an ally, in the in the context of not being necessarily it being their kind of their life's work, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I'd say go for it and read stuff. Like most trans theology that I've read is really accessible. I think or hope that both of my books are really accessible. Like
Yeah,
academic disciplines, and particularly the discipline of theology, are actually really struggling. And one of the benefits of that is that the where the cracks start to appear, things open up. So people are encouraged to write in a much more popular style now. The other kind of aspect of that is that you can write too. So if you have
yeah,
experiences, either as a trans person or as someone who knows trans people, right? Like suggest to your church newsletter or denominational magazine, like, I want to write something about this. Get involved politically, write to your MPs when like a bit of legislation comes up. But I think this kind of theologians or not theologians thing often gets us tied up in knots, and actually, we're all theologians. I really
yeah,
strongly believe in the priesthood of all believers. And if there's any value in academic theologians, it's only to raise up and bring out the voices of theologians who are not
yeah,
academic.
yeah,
So for me, there doesn't need to be a divide. And if you think you've got something to say or to talk about, let's have a conversation. Because one of the things I love doing is curating other people's voices, actually. I get
yeah,
really fed up of my own voice. I'd
yeah,
far rather be able to hear lots of other people's
yeah,
voices. That's what I kind of tried to do in the book and the PhD. So that was bringing together 10 other trans and non-binary people and hearing their voices. And that's what I'd like to continue doing, really, because I think one person's opinion alone is just one person's opinion, but lots of
absolutely.
opinions together kind of mean something.
Yeah. And I wanted to build on that. So, I mean, I often say, once you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person, and you have one lived experience. I guess my question to you is, did your research back that up? Was there a real plethora of views, or was there a harmonization of opinions from the people you spoke to?
So there were certain things that everyone agreed on. So, for example, everyone agreed that really definitive theology is bad. Like everyone thought we
Yeah,
can't know everything about God and we need to kind of
yeah,
disentangle some of this stuff. So that was something that there was uniform agreement on, and there were a couple of things like that. There were some things that people split into one or two camps on. So, for example, in terms of God's gender, absolutely no one said that they didn't care about God's gender, but people tended to split into two camps: those who thought that God was utterly genderless, so that the idea of God having a gender was totally nonsensical, and those who thought that God was really genderful, so that God really embodied all of potential gender. And so the theory I ended up coming up with was that God was both entirely genderless and entirely genderful. So there were those spaces where we divided into camps. And then there were things on which people were completely individual and unique. And I think I'd particularly want to say across any sort of theological spectrum, people were totally individual and unique. We had from a relatively conservative theological perspective right through to a very, very progressive one. So I think sometimes, trans people get pigeonholed as being
yeah,
like, let's throw everything out and be really progressive. But actually, there are lots of different trans voices, and there's a risk that we marginalize some trans people when we assume that all trans people think the same
yeah,
way. Some of the people involved in my research would see themselves as queer and would see transness as a queer
yeah,
identity. Whereas for others, actually, it was simply a process that they had to go through, and now
yeah,
they identified as a woman or a man, and they didn't actually identify with the LGBTQIA plus
yeah.
community. So I think it's important to note those differences, really.
Yeah. And I guess having I mean, it's just an amazing opportunity to meet all those people. What were there some particular stories, some particular things that kind of really stuck out for you along that journey? And I guess, the question that's kind of hovering at the back of my mind is what changed you through that study? Was we're all continuing to form and grow. Was there something that kind of you thought, God, actually, that's really made me think differently about my own practice and understanding?
So for me, it's the whole euphoria thing. And this was, so to give a bit of background for those who don't know about gender euphoria, this was a whole movement that started in and around trans communities. And it really started to become a mainstream thing when Elliot Page, who is a trans actor, took a picture of themselves with their top off. It was on the cover of a magazine. And they just looked really happy. And like it was more than happiness, it was this kind of deep sense of wholeness that you could just see kind of vibrating through them. And it was really exciting. And so this movement of gender euphoria came up as opposed to gender dysphoria, just kind of thinking of transness as all the things that we dislike about ourselves, which is very easy to slip into as a trans person.
Mm.
And which the medical establishments kind of expect us to be able to slip into and talk about. So it was a really important movement, but actually my research started quite a long time before that movement became mainstream. And I hadn't really heard of the idea of gender euphoria or really thought about it. And one of my participants talked about it. It really foregrounded everything that he said. And he said that that God was sprinkling breadcrumbs of delight out before him,
That's
and he
so
was
cool.
following those breadcrumbs of delight. And for him, that's what transition was. It was following breadcrumbs of delight. And I was just absolutely moved by that. And it made me reconsider everything about how I did trans theology and how I thought and spoke about being trans. Because up until that point, I always started with when I was a child, I felt like an alien, and it was all really depressing and bad, and all these horrific things happened to me. You could probably find like things on YouTube of me talking like that. And like, I kind of positive. I did talk about transition as a journey towards joy, but I was kind of saying, people need to support trans people because it's really hard. And we'll say a bit more about that later because it is still really hard.
Yeah,
But what I never did was talk about my journey from a position of joy and to say, actually, you should support trans people because we're living our best lives and it's great. And don't you want a bit of that, you know?
yeah,
Like to be
absolutely.
able to tell my story from that joyful perspective and to be able to talk about it not as God kind of saving me from this despairing
Yeah,
thing, but actually about being on a journey with God and a journey of delighting and coming to know more about ourselves. That to me was really exciting and really novel. And yeah, just changed how I did everything, changed what topics in theology I thought were relevant to trans people.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, just totally transformative.
yeah. Yeah, no, I completely agree. So having transitioned 8 years ago, I've often said since then, I didn't realize this level of happiness was actually possible in my life. I kind of, I didn't even realize. And so you're right, there's kind of there's always a downside and there's difficult times, but actually the happiness that kind of comes from finally living authentically is just incredible. I guess that leads me to kind of think about, so is there a knock-on effect of that for the church? Obviously, kind of LGBT folk in general have kind of been excluded often from being able to be in the church, and trans people kind of as part of that. So, do you think that kind of that joy, that euphoria, also translates into what we have to offer the church, and more generally, what do we offer the church?
Um, so firstly, I think I'd just say yes, absolutely. We had our LGBT History Month service at Downing Place, which is the church I work out of, last Sunday, and we had an LGBT choir singing. And at the end of the service, they taught the whole church this kind of protest chant that goes. One fine day, I believe one fine day, the power of love will overcome the love of power. I believe that one fine day, the power of love will overcome the love of power. And we all started singing it together as we went out of church. And it was just this moment, I would say, of euphoria and of wholeness, of community. And, it's a church with a great musical tradition, but as we were doing it, I was thinking, I've never heard this church like this before. I've never
Oh,
heard this
that's
church
amazing.
sing like this before. And I think that's partly about joy and it's partly about struggle, and we can't separate the two. And I think that LGBTQIA plus people, and perhaps particularly trans people, and you can see it in some of the early photos of Marsha and others in the Stonewall riots, that we found a way to meet struggle with joy. And that's something that I think Christianity, particularly in the kind of post-Christian times where they're having to think differently about what it means to be a Christian, actually finding that joy again and not just being like, oh, it's all really bad. I
Yeah,
think it's really important. But I also think that we are capable of helping institutions to undo some of the binaries they get stuck in. So that same person who talked about joy talked about the fact that gender is seen as such a kind of basic binary that as soon as you start to unpick gender, there's massive power in that because everything else topples. You can start to unpick everything else and start to think differently. So I guess I would say that's the other bit of power we have, that we can help people to think differently and not just about transness, about everything.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm completely with you on that. One of the things that I really loved about your book is the final chapter. And it made me laugh because if people haven't kind of read your book so far, you open up the final chapter by saying, "Finally, someone's given me a chance to answer all the questions that I get asked all the time in one place, so that if they ever ask me it again, I can just point to that my chapter and say, read the answer there." Which just really, really amused me. But I guess, has that stopped? Are there questions you get kind of still get over and over again? Or, where are you up to now with that? Do you just refuse to answer them? Where are you at with that?
I mean, I do still get the same questions, and it only frustrates me really when I'm asked to write. So, like, often a magazine or a journal will be like, "Can you write about your journey?" And I'm like, "No, I don't want to write about my journey anymore. I've done that."
Yeah,
Um, when it's in conversation, I'm better at being graceful, I think. The questions have got more binary because really reasonable people are really falling into culture wars or really being
yeah,
tricked by some of the really damaging narratives that are out
yeah,
there. So I think in some ways I'm getting asked worse questions than I was before. And I
yeah,
guess the main thing that's changed is I'm trying to think of different ways to answer them and more
yeah,
creative ways to answer them, because I think simply sharing what I feel isn't enough.
yeah,
You need something more political because we're in this position, unfortunately, where people are messing around with truth and
yeah,
actually rewriting history in order to counter trans people. And that really changes how you can even have a conversation about transness.
yeah,
Because now, when I'm asked those questions, it's rarely out of curiosity, which is, it always just used to be people were really curious about certain things.
yeah,
Now I'm usually asked them with a side of the person saying, because I'm really worried about this, or
yeah,
this is why I think it's not okay to be trans.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it puts you in a different place, really.
yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, it was really interesting. I think, at the point when I transitioned, so back in August 2017, not long, it hadn't been long before that Laverne Cox had been on the front of Time. Time magazine had trumpeted, this is the transgender tipping point. This is the kind of revolution. This is where everything starts to change in a positive way. And it just feels like since then, largely in lots of areas, in terms of public discourse, I think, interestingly, kind of things feel like they've gone backwards. And I guess my question for you is, we talked before about gender euphoria. When you're facing sometimes that onslaught, how do you maintain that kind of sense of positivity, that sense of balance in a context that is not necessarily being supportive?
I think part of it is you used the word balance, and I think balance is really important. And we were talking before we came on about the fact that how things can feel as a trans person personally compared to how things feel when you engage with media or social media, for example, is really different. So I cannot switch on social media at the moment, even in my bubbles, without seeing something about something Trump has said. We're constantly
Mm,
bombarded with news about people thinking we're wrong and effectively wanting us to not exist as a result, which is,
yeah,
it's violent. It's really violent. People might as well be saying they want to murder us because what they're saying is
yeah,
you do not exist or you should not exist. Um, so if I spent as much time on social media as I used to, I couldn't cope. Um,
yeah,
but when I'm with my friends or living my life, it doesn't really impact me. So I think building up those networks of solidarity is really important. And I think if you don't have that yet, whoever you are, whether you're trans or not, if you're on this call, you're going to be someone who is going to care when things get
yeah,
difficult for people who are in minority groups. So you need a network of solidarity because for trans people in America right now, I think it's much harder to find that balance because what we're reading about on our screens is what's happening there.
yeah,
People are losing their jobs. People are getting their passports taken away from them. People are getting put in prison. People are losing their access to healthcare. People are having their homes and their families attacked. People are having their children taken away from them. These are real world consequences. And we've seen ways in which there are moves towards similar politics in the UK, even with a change of government. There are still massive moves towards reducing trans access to healthcare. And that's absolutely terrifying if you think about it too much. So now
yeah,
is the time to build those networks of solidarity so that we can help each other practically
yeah,
and hold each other up if we get into the sort of really dangerous situation that trans people in
yeah,
America are currently facing. I'm an American dual national, and one of the first conversations I had with my mom a few days after Trump's inauguration was about the fact that I can't go to America. Because if I go, the likelihood from friends who have done that is my passport will be taken and I'll be put in prison until a female passport can be issued. Body scanners are being weaponized against trans people entering the country. So we
yeah,
need to realize that, yes, we need to have euphoria and we can do that by not overly focusing on this kind of news. But at the same time, we have to be aware that these things are happening because it's dangerous. And if
yeah,
you just kind of become completely unaware about the danger that's going on, then we could end up in the same place.
yeah. And I'm aware this question is about to sound potentially quite loaded, but I think it's an important question to consider is, does this mean that there's any point to try and engage with people on social media anymore?
I prefer taking things off social media. I don't mind doing it on social media, but so many times I've seen people engage and it just turns into a comment row. And actually, as soon as you're arguing with someone, you're going to sound stupid too, because
Yeah,
that's how that sort of argument works out. I don't think that that means people shouldn't do it, but just to be aware that it can become pointless. And I basically barely argue on social media at all anymore because it was harming me because I'd spend like 3 hours in a night having a debate with someone who was never going to come round to my point of view.
yeah,
Whereas, on Sunday morning, I was speaking in church in front of over 150 people, several of whom I know do not agree with trans rights,
yeah,
and many others of whom in the space may not agree with trans rights. And I'm able to say things like, actually, Section 28 is happening again for trans people
yeah,
now.
yeah,
So being able to have real life conversations face to face in public where we can be
yeah,
overheard, I think is also really powerful. And I think so from that perspective, I would say social media activism isn't wrong. It might burn
yeah,
you out, but it's not harmful. If that's all you're doing, if the only way that you are standing up for trans people is on social media, this is going to sound really harsh now to listeners, but I want to
no,
say
no,
it
I think it's
clearly.
important.
If that is the only way that you're standing up for trans people, then you're not standing up for trans people because to be heard, you need to do it in public. When a friend or a relative tells you that they're really concerned about women's safety in toilets, for example, you need to tell them the stats. You know, you need to tell them
Yeah,
the vanishingly low numbers of people that have ever been attacked by a trans woman. We need to
yeah,
um, actually have these conversations and not just think, oh, I'm just not going to touch that because it's a hot topic, because um, that's when, I think people think that the majority of the public are against trans people, but they aren't.
yeah,
They're just not having the conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I have to echo that. A couple of times recently, I've spoken at different events that were primarily aimed for cis people, and there was one of them where someone, after I'd spoken, said, "I've never heard from a trans person before, and you've changed my mind about how I think about trans people." And apart from obviously me feeling like, wow, that's just incredible that that person had the honesty to kind of to do that, it really felt like actually in a way that I've not had for a long time. It was a real kind of breakthrough in terms of actually realizing that, influence is going to happen in person, it's going to happen offline, it's not going to necessarily happen, as you say, by these kind of to and froing kind of rows. The question that also leads, and this may be kind of not necessarily relevant for people who are on the call today, but I think it probably will be an interesting thing for people to kind of hear, is what are the recommendations you would give to someone who is considering transitioning at the moment? How do they make sure that that's a positive experience, and that is something that, is it the same as it always has been, or are there different rules and different dynamics now that need to be considered?
That's really interesting, actually. I haven't thought about that question specifically, although I think I've thought about a lot of the issues surrounding it. When I first transitioned, I was really lucky because one of the major private clinics where trans people are seen had just opened, and I was able to be seen within, 5 minutes, really, without having to be on a waiting list. I took out a massive overdraft. I'm still paying it off, but it meant I was able to transition really quickly, and I do think that that's been transformative for how I've been able to live my life. I think not having
Yeah,
that gap that so many trans people have has made a massive difference. Conversely, my best friend is currently on the waiting list. They've been on the waiting list for years and years and years. He's still waiting. He's managed to have top surgery privately, but he can't get on testosterone, even though he's got a private referral. His GP won't accept it because they say they don't know enough. And
yeah,
from what I'm reading, this is happening more and more often. So even when the NHS, you're kind of waiting, and that's one thing. If you have to wait for the NHS, that's really, really hard. But even when people are trying to skip that and going privately, they're still finding that they can't get access to the healthcare that they need. So I guess one of the things that I'd say is consider not focusing on healthcare. So, and I know that's shit, basically, because actually we
yeah,
really, really need trans affirming healthcare. However, one of the participants in my book spoke about the fact that she thought that surgeries were going to be the thing that were going to be really, really important. And actually, when she started to be seen as female, that became more important. And that was
yeah,
actually the thing that made her feel like she had transitioned. So I think what
yeah,
I say to people is be aware that you're going to wait, no matter
yeah,
what, you're going to have to wait a long time for affirming healthcare. Do start to go privately if you can, because it puts you in a better position. If you don't have the funds to do that by yourself, look up trans mutual aid projects, because there are places that you can get access to those funds. But even with that, also focus on the social, focus on how you can share with people around you who you are, how you can find spaces where you can be with other trans people to build up that network of solidarity, and how you can actually affirm yourself and make yourself feel positive about who you
yeah,
are, which is really difficult. And it's still, I don't think you'll mind me saying, Sarah, that I think it's still a struggle that both of us face
yeah,
every single day,
yeah,
doing that self-affirmation. But it's not just a kind of woolly idea that we should say mantras or something. It's actually a really
yeah,
tough practice that you have to do to survive the world. We have to remind ourselves that, we're good at stuff and we're worthwhile
yeah,
human beings.
yeah,
So I'd say that, like, build those networks of support and take time. It's really easy to rush when you first transition. And by that, I'm not talking about medical care, go at
yeah,
whatever speed you want or can with that. But in terms of our own narratives, because we've known who we are for a long time, it's really easy to immediately want everyone to be with us. And
yeah,
I totally get that. But often it can end to the rupturing of relationships. And
yeah,
actually, um, if you're able to slow down at all and recognize that other people need to go on a journey with you, that might not be possible, and some relationships might have to rupture.
Yeah.
But if it's possible at all to kind of slow down and think, okay, this person's trying, I'm going to gently remind them again, we're
Yeah.
going to get there. And not
Yeah.
try and find your affirmation in other people, but actually try and find a way to
Yeah.
build that up in yourself.
Yeah, no, absolutely, completely. And I was just looking at the Q&A while you were talking, and someone has just commented to say that was a really helpful kind of answer, because there's almost, that kind of understanding of what lies ahead for people who are going through this process at the moment is so important. I couldn't leave this conversation without bringing it back to Open Table, given that's partly why we're here tonight, and clearly you're undertaking another transition, as it were, from co-chair to patron. And I wondered if you'd had a chance to kind of reflect on your time as co-chair, having kind of done 3 years in that particular role, whether there were what kind of stuck out to you, as what did you learn from that? What did you take away from it? What did you learn about the LGBT community? What sticks in your mind as some of your achievements or highlights from that time as co-chair?
So I think that one of the massive things I learned was the level of diversity there is, and just visiting other open table communities and recognizing that they
Yeah,
are so broad, and that the LGBTQI plus Christians and others within them are so broad, and that that's actually
yeah,
really rather wonderful.
yeah,
Um, so kind of finding that joy in diversity, which I'd kind of academically known, but to actually experience it has been really powerful, and to recognize, that an open table community of like 4 to 8 people that is really unconfident in kind of how they're worshipping and isn't quite sure whether they're needed and is working out like
yeah,
what they're doing is actually just as valuable, if not more, than an open table community that has, 30 to 50 people showing up and is really professional
yeah,
led and all of that kind of thing. Like recognizing actually it's about community and it's about diversity. So that'd be one
yeah,
thing. I'm going to say 3 things just to
yeah. No,
that's the
good.
first one. Um,
all
the
good. All good talks have 3 points. So yeah,
um, the second one I think is that we need to get better at asking for stuff.
yeah,
So one of the things I'm really proud of is seeing us helping to see us through quite a major grant application,
yeah,
the URC. And firstly, I never would have thought that I was capable of filling in that kind of paperwork.
yeah,
So
yeah,
to be able to actually do that and succeed was really important. But also, I think we were quite reticent to ask for stuff. And we were
yeah,
a lot more concerned about, well, what can we give in return?
yeah,
Um, and I think that comes out of a place of marginalization, that it's really hard for people who have been marginalized, particularly within an institution, to ask for what they need.
yeah,
And actually, what we do is important, and we need to get better at asking for stuff, because
yeah,
there are still lots of denominations that will happily use LGBT people to resource themselves, but
yeah,
will not resource LGBT um, communities
yeah,
themselves. So I think
yeah,
asking for what we need and making it really clear that those needs are there, which has been so wonderfully shown over and over again by
yeah,
Open Table, is really
yeah,
important.
yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
if I was from certain denominations, I'd be giving you a big amen there to that point. Yeah. So
and
yeah.
then the
Sorry. Yeah.
third one I'd say, and I'm starting to wonder if saying that Open Table is for LGBT people is the wrong way round, because I
Yeah.
don't think Open Table is for LGBTQIA plus people. I think Open Table centers LGBTQIA plus
Yeah.
people. So at my own Open Table community in Cambridge, I would say on the average Sunday night, about half of the people who are there are LGBTQIA plus, and the other half are not. And of that other half that are not, some would claim the title ally or a different word if they find that
Yeah.
word problematic. But many actually, they're coming because you know what, they need something different from what
Yeah.
happens in the morning service,
Yeah.
or the time of other church services really doesn't work for them,
Yeah.
or the style of this service is better for them, or they like the fact that it's a really open space where people talk about
Yeah.
themselves. Like they're not coming because it's for LGBT people. but they're
Yeah.
becoming because centering LGBT people's experiences has changed what it means to be church in those
Yeah.
communities and actually has made them better church community.
Yeah.
So I guess one thing I'd want to say is if you've not been to Open Table, just go. And they're all different.
Yeah.
Don't like it,
Yeah.
try and find the next one, even if
Yeah.
it's 2 hours away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, recognize that it's not about doing something kind for LGBT people, because actually we don't need charity.
Yeah.
What we need is to show people that we can reshape ways of thinking and worshiping.
Yeah.
And that's why I love doing the LGBT History Month service that we did last week, which is it's not an open table service, so it's a service that Open Table Cambridge leads for the morning congregation. So the majority of people who are there, haven't asked to be in an LGBT centering service.
Yeah.
They're just going to church in the morning, and suddenly they're in this space where LGBT lives are being centered, and actually
Yeah.
it's transformative for them. It's not that it's
Absolutely.
transformative for LGBT people, it's that it's transformative for everyone else. And I
Yeah.
think that's the true power of minorities. And I
Yeah.
really, yeah, just I guess I want to be proud of that because we often talk about the ways in which we're powerless, and that
Yeah.
stops us using the power that we do have.
And it kind of goes back to the point you're making previously that actually there's something about what LGBT people bring to the world and to the church that is reflected through that, I think. But also the other thing that kind of amazed me really when I first started, so I'm nearly at my 5 year point of being part of Open Table, and I think that seeing so many people who actually had been marginalized by the church in so many other ways, finding a home there was just incredible. So even down to people who had been divorced or people who are neurodiverse or, for all sorts of kind of reasons, felt like actually a place where you can be authentically yourself, whoever you are, whatever you're about, actually is a massive difference, really. Obviously, you're moving to become a patron now, so I guess some people will be scratching their head saying, "Well, what's a patron? What does a patron do? And do you have a kind of hopes and dreams for your time as a patron of this organization?"
So I think for me, a lot of it is about speaking up for Open Table in public. At present, I work in a local church setting, and I have spoken about and for Open Table lots of times doing that. But I'm moving to a more national role, which I can't say much more about at the moment, but that gives me the ability, I guess, to network in a different way and to be
Yeah,
really able to actually celebrate the fact that there is this organization creating these communities and that these communities have power and potential in all sorts of ways to be able to kind of facilitate some of that kind of big scale networking or
yeah,
celebrating open table, I think is really exciting. I guess I'd also say when you're a trustee, it's really hard. I know there are some trustees on the call, so I almost feel guilty saying this to you, particularly newer ones, but it's hard work, right? And you can get really stuck in the weeds because you have a lot of responsibilities and they're really
yeah,
technical. And I think an outsider can kind of say the things like, it's not for LGBT people, it's centering
yeah,
LGBT people.
yeah,
We can make those comments. So I'm really excited that in a few weeks the patrons are meeting together with Kira
yeah,
and
yeah,
Sarah, and I hope we'll have a chance to kind of offer some feedback about where Open Table is going. So I think having friends along the journey who are able to say, well, have you thought about this? Or do you know
yeah,
that that looks like that? And kind of
yeah,
prompt in a different way that isn't about governance, but is just about that kind of, I guess, PR side and making connections
yeah, yeah.
is really exciting.
So there are some questions. I've got one more that I want to ask you, but I'll ask it just before we finish, because I want to give a chance to the questions we've got here. So let me start off with the first one that came in. So someone's saying they are an Anglican minister, have recently come out as queer non-binary, and are currently celebrating having changed their name with their church family. They really like your books, Alex, so you got a plug for that. Um, and all the kind of resources, liturgical resources you've created for worship. And they'd asked if you could talk a little bit about your process. So, how does kind of a new liturgy come about? Do you feel kind of called to create it? Is it instinctive? Where does that come from?
Yep. So one of the things I'd say, which is really frustrating, but it's also true for me, I know it's not true for everyone, is that I can only write when I feel like writing. And that's particularly true of creative writing, like liturgies. Factual writing, I can make myself do it at any time, but emotional writing, I have to be in the mood, and that might be through having a conversation or through reading an article or listening to the news or seeing something that really annoyed me on social media and being like, I just need to write now. So I'm giving my last sermon in Downing Place at Open Table in a couple of weeks. It's way too early to write the sermon, but last night I got really annoyed about something completely unrelated and I was able to write the sermon. So I think that would be the first thing to say, like, if you get the right moment, grab it. You know, that was about 10 o'clock at
Yeah.
night and I was watching TV. So traditional ministerial education would say that that's really bad boundaries. But I've found that I have to use my time when I can, and then I'll carve out
Yeah.
some time for me at a different time to
Yeah.
make that work. So that'd be the first thing. The second thing would be to say it depends whether I am responding to specific pieces of scripture. So, for example, if I'm using the lectionary or if I'm writing something specific for a particular event or theme. So, if I'm writing for a particular event or a theme, then the first thing I'll do is say, well, what piece of scripture speaks to me about that and start from there. So, once I have a bit of scripture, whether it's that way or through the lectionary, what I do is I put that bit of scripture and any other resources I have on the topic, quotes that I like, things like that, in one document on one side of a screen, and I'll have a blank document on the other side of the screen, and I'll just start playing creatively with some of the words and phrases and ideas. And usually from that, I'll find some sort of corner, something that stands out for me. So recently it was the perseverant widow that I was looking at,
Yeah.
and it was this idea of her crying out for justice again and again and again. And that was what really spoke to me, that sense of, I guess, persistent campaigning in the light of a politics that is against us. And that it was from that feeling, I guess, that the entire liturgy for my LGBT History Month service last week sprung up. And I then used songs that were related, that were being used in the service as well to kind of finesse that and shape that so that
Yeah.
a thread goes throughout. I don't like it when kind of there's a Thanksgiving prayer here and intercessions over there. There's got to be words that are kind of carrying through the whole thing.
Connecting it through. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. That's really, really helpful. Just building on justice, as someone who's asked a question clearly with a real heart for justice, kind of saying from one of our open table communities, saying, have you got some suggestions of what someone might do to ensure that justice is ensured for all? It's a big
First,
question.
yeah, it is a really big question. And I guess part of the answer would be you can't. So I was listening recently to someone talking about Palestine, someone who was Palestinian, and they said, you know, this is what I dream about and hope for. They gave this particular solution. This is what I dream about and hope for, but I know that that's impossible. And I came back with, actually, it's really good that we know that it's impossible because that means we will never stop trying. And I think
Yeah,
that's really important. So not thinking that there's an end goal that you're going to reach, but that
yeah,
actually that there's an impossible dream that you're like continually
yeah,
struggling towards. And then the second thing I'd say is keep being authentic and keep being honest about your experiences, and that will then lead other people to share their experiences with you. So I found it really helpful that you wrote in that question about who you are. And I think grounding your work for justice in who you are can really help you to be authentic, and other people will see that and be drawn to that. And
yeah,
that's kind of what's happened for me. I'm not particularly good at anything. I'm
yeah,
just someone that's been kind of honest, and
yeah,
that draws other honest people together.
yeah, 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 absolutely. And the final question that was kind of into the mix was someone who has recently transitioned or is kind of in the process of transitioning. They identify as male but don't pass yet, and their vicar's just struggling to kind of see them as male when they're not necessarily passing as male at the moment. They don't want to give up on the church because it's a really good inclusive church, but wondered if there's anything they could do to make those conversations easier for everyone who's involved and is kind of in and around that particular around them really.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm going to answer this and try and answer the next one together because another one's just popped in, which is that I think that conversations get difficult when people think that they're having to defend a position. So for that first questioner, I guess you're often in a position where you have to defend yourself
Yeah,
against other people, and that's a really hard thing to do. So trying to take the conversations out of that context, actually, trying, for example, to slip kind of facts about what being trans is like for you into everyday conversations rather than it always happening at formal meetings or as part of debate, I think can be really, really helpful, making it not them and us. But
Yeah,
actually, well, we're all doing this together. How can we journey together on this by conversing well together? And I think that's part of my answer to the next person as well, who's talked about how can we kind of actually be ourselves when we might get cancelled in the queer community if we don't agree with everything that's currently being said. And I guess for me, it's about how we engage with diversity and how we share who we are. So I think you can share what you think and believe in ways that are honest, but it's really important to actually do that because I think when we hold things back, it furthers that sense of culture war. And I think it's really likely that other people around you in that community probably actually know or suspect what you think,
yeah,
and that not being able to have a conversation about it makes them feel just as awkward as it makes you feel. And actually being able to have a reasoned conversation, not where you're debating, not where the answer is going to be that one side or the other is right, but where you're actually sharing what you feel and they're sharing what they feel. And at the end, you're both just saying, well, thank you for sharing that. And there doesn't have to be a right and a wrong.
yeah,
And actually, we can live with diversity. Because what I often find is that in the culture war dynamic, there's always this idea that someone has to be wrong. And that only happens if people are denying other people's rights. So, if that person who, doesn't agree with everything talked about today in the queer community, if that then extends to wanting to deny some people their human rights, then I would want to be starting to have a different type of conversation.
yeah,
But if actually you just want to express some opinions and be heard, then like let's do that. And I would say
yeah,
if you want to use me as a first step, then like please reach out because I am having that experience with a few people at the moment where I suspect that they think things that they're not telling me. And actually I'd rather
yeah,
you just said it and we could have a conversation about
yeah.
it.
Yeah, I think honesty is definitely the best policy. You started to allude to it earlier, but what does the future hold for you then? So obviously being a patron is one of those things, but what else is there in store for you over the coming months and years?
Yeah, so I'm still writing. I love writing and I love research. And there's kind of two writing projects that I'm doing at the moment, but they kind of fit together. So I've moved out of only writing queer theology, and I also write in the areas of disability theology and trauma related theology now. And I'm really interested in writing about intersectionality and how people who have experienced multiple oppression, so who are oppressed because of multiple identity characteristics, how that functions, and particularly when one of those characteristics is always noticed or talked about. Um, how can we kind of talk more, I guess, authentically and broader about ourselves when we're doing theology? So that's one thing. And the second is that I want to talk about culture wars and I want to talk about really secular culture wars and where actually religious ideology underpins them, and to be able to write a bit about that because I think a lot of it is hidden and a lot of the people who are propagating culture wars would say that they are absolutely atheist, but there's a lot of religious ideology underlying what they're saying, or religious assumptions underlying what they're saying. So I want to do some work on that because I don't believe that the way to win culture wars is by continuing to have culture wars. I think we
Yeah,
need to undermine
absolutely.
the whole
Yeah,
binary thing altogether. So that's in terms of writing. In terms of my life, as I've said, I'm moving from local ministry to a role with a national organization. I can't quite say what that is yet. So I finish up in Cambridge in the middle of March. And, I'll still be in ministry, but I'm increasingly compelled by non-stipendiary ministry and by the idea that one of the most effective ways in which we can minister is to do something else and to go to lots of different places on Sundays and
yeah,
see how we can navigate that. So I'm really excited about that change and just seeing what's in store for me.
perfect.
And I guess the only thing I'd add to that is I'm now a full-time wheelchair user, and it's something that sometimes people assume that some of the changes in my life are difficult or challenging. And I guess one of the things I just want to leave people with is that I'm experiencing some difficulty and stress at the moment, but also a lot of joy. And that for me, using mobility aids has given me the freedom to be in a lot less pain, and to actually live joyfully. So I hope that in the future you'll experience a slightly less ranty Alex and a slightly more uh, actually, yeah, really excited to engage with new people and new things. I kind of have a new lease on life really at the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah, fantastic. That's perfect. And thank you so much for your time this evening. Honestly, it's the conversation's been really, really valuable. There's so many important points I think that we've got through. So thank you. As Alex kind of hinted, we are getting our patrons together in March, on the 15th of March, for a meeting in London, where we are going to explore with them what is going on in the world of Open Table. To get any kind of feedback or advice from them will be incredibly helpful. But what we thought we might do as part of that day is we've allocated an hour where we're going to webcast the meeting. Alex is going to chair a discussion for us, and we're webcasting the meeting out to anyone who wants to join in, for you to listen to the patrons having a conversation around what are some of the issues, what is around LGBT issues, what's going on in some of their own denominations, what have been some of their observations from their own experiences. So we're really, really looking forward to it. Thank you so much for being here. As Alex said, be shameless. So if there's anyone who is outside Open Table and you want to make a contribution to Open Table, please feel free to do that. You can contact us on our website, and we're always looking for people to help and support us, both with prayer and financially, and for all sorts of other reasons as well. So do please engage with us. That would be absolutely amazing. And in the meantime, thank you so much, and we'll hopefully see some of you in a couple of weeks at the Patron webinar. In the meantime, God bless.